When I first moved into the cabin my grandfather built, tucked deep in the northern ridge of Westridge County, the last thing I expected was a battle with a homeowners association. Back then, the thought of paperwork and politics climbing this high into the trees seemed impossible. The closest cul-de-sac sat nearly a mile down the hill, and my deed faded and folded, hidden in a lockbox beneath the floorboards dated back to years before the HOA was even formed. This mountain runs in my veins. After retiring from 32 years as a geological engineer, half of which I spent on National Guard deployments for disaster assessment, it was the only place I felt I could truly breathe. My name is Franklin Hale. I'm 61, divorced, childless. To some, I might look like an easy mark, an old man alone in the woods with a beard and a dog named Jasper. But don't be fooled. I know every inch of this land better than the people who tried to take it, and I knew before they did that their pride would end up costing them dearly. The storm didn't hit all at once. It started quietly, like a faint rumble of thunder on a sunny day. In those early months of retirement, my mornings were simple black coffee steaming in a thermos, Jasper curled at my feet, the fog rising slowly off the trees. I cleared my own trails, built my own well, ran solar panels along a quiet ridge where the wind couldn't catch them. I wasn't rebelling against society. I just preferred a life off the grid. Then the newsletters came. Glossy paper crammed into my mailbox, boasting about new developments, upgraded playgrounds, and community connectivity through extended trails. They called it progress. I saw it as a warning, because those trails they were planning, they cut straight into the eastern slope of my land. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. I'd never signed anything placing my property under HOA control. My cabin sat outside the original boundary, and my grandfather had been careful about that when he purchased the land back in 1958. But over the years, the HOA had spread like ivy, slow, invasive, and relentless. That afternoon, I walked the ridgeline with Jasper, boots crunching across stones I knew by heart. The land there wasn't just meaningful to me, it was unstable. I'd mapped it myself years ago while consulting for the state's geological department. Beneath the soil was a web of fractured rock and ancient landslide zones, long dormant, never safe. Anyone with the ability to read a topographic map would know better than to dig there. But HOA presidents don't read maps, they read budgets and picture ribbon cuttings. I drafted a letter, polite yet firm. I laid out the geological risks, attached scanned pages from the 1986 fault survey, and mailed it certified to both the HOA office and the county zoning board. Then I waited. Weeks slipped by. The only response I received was another glossy newsletter. This time, the tone was sharper. It announced that the trail expansion had been approved unanimously. It praised community vision and promised open spaces for generations ahead. At the bottom, it listed the construction timeline. Excavation, July. I stared at that line for a long while. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, that dry, knowing drawl he used whenever someone was acting foolish. Give them rope, Frank. They'll hang themselves twice. The first bulldozer arrived on July 3rd. I heard it before I saw it, a low mechanical groan that echoed through the valley, harsh and foreign. Jasper barked, sprinting toward the ridge. I followed, my heart pounding. And there it was, yellow paint, fresh tracks, a driver in a reflective vest studying a clipboard. Like he owned the place. I shouted. He looked up, startled, killed the engine. I knew right away he wasn't in charge, just a hired hand. He pointed downhill toward a white SUV at the base of the slope. That's where I met her. Pamela Voss, HOA president. Tall, pressed. Khakis, sunglasses fixed to her face. She smiled as if I'd come down to welcome her with banana bread. "Mr. Hale," she said, offering a hand I refused. "So glad you came. We're finally moving forward up here." "You're trespassing," I told her. The smile never wavered. "Oh, I don't think so. This section is part of the community. Expansion now, it was voted on." "I didn't attend that meeting," I said flatly, "because this isn't your jurisdiction. It's private land. Mine." She waved at the slope, dismissive. "It's complicated." "No," I said, "it's not." And in that moment, I realized this wasn't confusion, it was entitlement wrapped in polyester. Pamela didn't care about geological data. She wanted her name etched on a plaque. A ribbon sliced before cameras. Safety meant nothing. Optics meant everything. I told her to leave. She told me to contact the board. Then she slid back into her SUV and drove off, leaving her machinery sitting on my soil. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind slip through the trees. Jasper curled beside me, ears twitching. I barely slept. My mind kept circling, back to that fragile slope. If they kept digging, the fallout wouldn't just be bureaucratic. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with Pamela Voss," I said. She gave a polite, strained smile. "President, Voss is in a board meeting. I can take a message." "It's urgent," I cut in. Before she could argue, the glass door swung open. Pamela stepped out, smoothing her blazer, coffee cup in hand like she was posing for a campaign poster. Her eyes landed on me just long. Enough to reveal a flash of irritation, then the smile returned. "Mr. Hale," she said warmly, as though we were neighbors catching up at the grocery store. "I brought something for you," I replied, holding out the folder. She accepted it, pretending interest, flipping through the papers. My deed. The 1986 geotechnical survey, the county's latest zoning map with my property clearly outside their reach. She didn't even finish before saying, "Well, I'm sure the board will be happy to review all of this." "Review isn't necessary," I said. "It's obvious. You're trespassing. Stop before someone gets hurt?" Pamela's smile thinned. "Mr. Hale, I understand your concerns, but we've already invested in infrastructure. These trails are designed to serve the community. You live here too, don't you?" "I live on my mountain," I said flatly. "That's not the same thing." She handed the folder back without breaking eye contact. "Thank you for your input." Input. That word rattled in my head as I walked back to the truck. It wasn't input. It was a warning. And they weren't listening. In the weeks that followed, more signs appeared. Survey markers staked along my boundary, pink flags fluttering. In the wind like invaders marking new ground. Pickup trucks with landscaping logos parked by the trailhead, crews milling around. I snapped photos, logged license plates, and waited. One morning at the diner, I overheard them, two board members, Greg Parsons and Tina Morales. They didn't even notice me, though we'd passed each other for years. "I heard they want to put a lookout deck on the ridge," Tina said, biting into her toast. "Pamela's already lining up donors." "That mountain guy's going to lose it," Greg chuckled. "You think he'll sue? Let him. The HOA's got lawyers for that." I didn't say a word. I paid for my coffee and walked out. But something shifted in me that morning. This wasn't about boundary lines anymore. It was about control, about power, and people who would crush anyone that stood in their way. I'd seen it before in my military career. This was just the civilian version, wrapped in pleasantries and paperwork instead of orders and uniforms. Still, I tried the proper channels. I filed a complaint with the county zoning board, submitted every document I had: geotechnical reports, deed records, even a highlighted copy of the original plat. They thanked me politely and promised a review within 60 business days. 60 days. Up here, 60 days could mean 3 full rain cycles. Enough time to turn minor erosion into a catastrophic landslide. I called an old colleague from my guard years, Eric Ramirez, now with the state's Department of Environmental Quality. He owed me a favor and I cashed it in. I sent drone footage of the ridge, flagged stakes, excavation markers, and the HOA's plan trail. 2 days later, Eric called back. "Frankie," he said, "that slope's unstable. If they cut into it and we get even moderate rainfall, it's going to move." "Can you issue a warning?" I asked. "I can draft an advisory," he said carefully. "But enforcement has to come local unless we prove a state-level hazard. For that, we'd need evidence of both activity and intent." "I'm working on it," I told him. And I set motion-triggered trail cams along the ridgeline, gathering daily footage. Every rock displaced, every stake planted, every truck that rolled through, I logged it all. Yet the pace only quickened. Pamela hosted community vision sessions, painting the trail as a gift for everyone. The fact that the HOA had no legal authority over the mountain didn't matter. Families showed up anyway, kids in strollers, neighbors with cameras posing for mock ribbon cuttings on ground. They didn't own Dot from the tree line. I watched in silence. Jasper growled low beside me. I knelt, resting a hand on his back. "I know, boy," I whispered. "They're building on lies. But nature doesn't care about politics. And it sure doesn't care about HOA dreams." It happened early one morning before the sun cleared the ridge. I was chopping wood near the back slope when Jasper's bark tore through the quiet. Not his usual alert, this one was deeper, uneasy, guttural. I froze, then followed his gaze. Through a thin curtain of pine branches, I spotted them, 2 backhoes, their yellow arms clawing at the pale morning sky, climbing the incline like mechanical beasts. The grind of steel against rock sent a surge of heat through my chest. They weren't surveying. They weren't marking. They were digging. I left the axe where it fell and strode toward the ridge, boots crunching over brittle needles and loose soil. By the time I reached the slope, the machines had already chewed into the upper trail, the one skirting dangerously close to the fractured shale formation I'd warned them about. A man in a reflective vest noticed me. Subcontractor, by the look just. Here to run diesel, not to care about consequences. "Hey!" I shouted over the roar. "Cut it! You're trespassing." He hesitated, then killed the engine. Dust settled. From the far side of the slope, a woman in a bright pink windbreaker appeared, clipboard in hand. Pamela, of course. Her ponytail bounced like punctuation marks on each step. "Mr. Hale." She called cheerfully, as though we'd run into each other on a morning walk. "So glad you're here. I was hoping we'd cross paths." "You're on my land," I said flatly. "Shut it down now." She lifted the clipboard. "Actually, this is part of the revised access route. The board approved the new alignment last week." "And I didn't," I shot back. "Because I'm not on your board. And this land doesn't belong to your HOA." Her smile tightened, condescending. "You're within the scenic corridor, Franklin. The HOA is responsible for maintaining continuity across community spaces." "Scenic corridor?" I barked a laugh. "You think slapping buzzwords on a bulldozer gives you ownership? This is deeded private property." Pamela waved the clipboard like a badge. "We've reviewed the surveys." I stepped forward, closer than was polite. I was a geological engineer for 32 years. I did the surveys. If you keep cutting into this slope, you'll trigger a slide that will bury everything downhill, including those houses you're pretending to connect. Her expression faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Then she straightened. "We've had independent consultants review the site. It's stable." "No," I said coldly. It isn't, and when it gives way, you'll be facing a lot more than a trespassing suit. Pamela raised her hand. Let's take a short break, she told the crew. Engines died. Men leaned on their machines, lit cigarettes, and stared at the dirt instead of me. I knew that look. Workers just cashing a paycheck, waiting for the boss to take the heat when it went bad. Pamela turned back. We're not your enemy. You're not my neighbor either, I replied. You're a corporation hiding behind flower beds and newsletters, I told her. Pamela didn't answer. She just offered a final smile, turned, and headed back to her SUV. A young assistant was already there, tapping furiously on a tablet. Within minutes, the engines roared back to life. The ground shook again as metal tore into the hillside. I stood there for a long moment. Then I walked back to the cabin and dug out my grandfather's old camcorder, the same one he'd used to film every season on this land. He'd taught me the habit right alongside stacking firewood and cleaning trout. I charged the battery, packed extra tapes, and climbed back up. That afternoon, I documented everything. Wide shots of the digging, close-ups of machines grinding, across my boundary lines, time-stamped footage of soil displacement, red flags marking unstable ground being ignored. I narrated it all, the documents, the violations, the arrogance. That night, I copied the files to 3 different drives. One I mailed to Eric Ramirez at the state office. Another I sent to a local news contact. The third I locked in a fireproof safe beneath the porch. They wanted a game? Fine, I had patience. And I had proof that by morning, the pushback came. A laminated notice hung from my cabin door, zip-tied to the handle. HOA letterhead, bold and official. A list of supposed violations, unauthorized fencing, non-compliant solar panels, unapproved land use. I left reading it. The solar setup they listed? Installed on a shed built 2 decades before the HOA ever existed. The fence? Hand-sawn pine from a 1997 storm. None of it carried legal weight, but that wasn't their goal. This was intimidation. A warning. If I fought, they'd fight harder. That same day, I got a voicemail from Craig Lanning, the HOA's attorney. His voice was smooth, careful, practiced. Mr. Hale, I understand you've raised concerns about the community project near your property. The board would like to meet, clarify boundaries, and reach a mutual understanding. Of course, we'd prefer to avoid unnecessary legal action. I didn't bother calling back. Instead, I wrote a formal cease and desist. Property deed citations. Legal code. Federal protections against unauthorized development. Sent certified mail to the HOA office, to Pamela herself, and to the county recorder. Still, the digging continued. That week, I heard it dynamite. Not a huge blast, just small charges, breaking apart rock ledges. But the sound ripped through me like a lightning strike. They were getting reckless. That night, I checked the trail cameras. The trail cam told the truth. A man crouched on the ridge, setting what looked like small charges not even 100 yards from the old shale fault. I sent the footage to Eric that night. His reply came. Fast. They're out of their minds. I'm escalating this. After that, the days bled together. Dust clouds rising with every sunrise, engines droning like hornets chewing through the hillside. Sleep stopped coming easy. I'd wake in the dark, listening for tremors that weren't there, convinced the mountain was about to give way. Pamela stopped showing up in person. She sent replacements, clipboard carriers, surveyors who avoided eye contact when I passed. Them in the woods. Deep down, they knew. They all knew this was wrong. But money had already moved, contracts signed, reputations staked. The machines couldn't stop now. Then the weather shifted. A storm rolled in on Thursday. Just a drizzle at first, carrying the sharp smell of wet pine and raw soil. I was on the ridge, checking their stakes and the scars their tracks had carved. Into the slope when I felt it. Not a quake, not yet. Just a faint flex beneath my boot. I knelt and brushed my hand over the loose shale. Damp, powdered fine. They'd carved too deep, stripped too wide. Rainwater was bleeding into layers that hadn't been touched in decades. Sediment not meant to bear weight, especially not under bulldozers and loaded dump trucks stopped back at the cabin. I dug out my seismic. Logs handwritten notes from the early 90s when I first began tracking this mountain. My grandfather always said the land breathed. He was right. It expanded and contracted with the seasons, tiny fractures opening and healing with the snowmelt. But this was different. They'd cut into livingstone and left it raw. That night, thunder rolled across the valley. Not the booming kind, but the sharp crackle that lingers like something splintering just out of sight. I stayed up late, poring over contour maps, drinking stale coffee, rewatching the ridge footage. The ground was whispering. And I was the only one listening. By morning, I'd made my choice. I put on my field jacket, printed 2 full geological reports, and set off down the trail into HOA territory. Jasper stayed tight at my side, his tail rigid, body alert. The clouds above hung heavy, swollen with the threat of real rain. At the construction site, I saw her, Pamela, standing beneath a white canopy with 2 other board members, Greg Parsons and Tina Morales, coffee cups in hand like this was a casual gathering. Below them, workers in hard hats swarmed like ants, shoving earth and bracing scaffolds. Against a half-framed structure, they'd begun cutting deeper into the slope. I didn't wait at the edge, I walked straight toward them. Pamela lowered her sunglasses, her expression flat. "Mr. Hale, another visit." I handed her the folder. "You need to stop. You're destabilizing a documented fault line." Tina let out a sharp laugh before even glancing at the papers. "Our engineers have reviewed everything. No signs of instability." "They're not geologists," I snapped. "They're civil contractors. That's like asking a house painter to diagnose a brain tumor." Greg reached to grab the folder, but Pamela held it tighter. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Hale, but the board has already voted. You've had your say, no." I steadied my voice. "You've heard me, but you don't understand the stakes." I pointed to the ridge. "That formation you're cutting into? It was labeled high risk for landslides in the 1986 state survey. The same survey your consultants conveniently ignored. I was there. I worked it. I know exactly what happens when you soak that ridge with water." Greg gave a low chuckle. "So what, you're predicting some kind of avalanche?" My answer came cold. "Not an avalanche. A deep-seated rotational slide. It won't collapse all at once, not immediately. But with every layer you strip away and every storm that rolls in, you're setting it in motion. And when it goes, you won't just lose the trail, you'll lose everything below it. Trees, homes, maybe even lives." For just a second, Tina's confidence cracked. Pamela's lips tightened. "You're fear-mongering, Mr. Hale, and this," she shook the folder, "isn't a legal order. You have no authority here." "I have expertise," I said. "And your time is running out." She shoved the folder back at me, unread. "You're dismissed." Dismissed. I'd heard that word before. The military teaches you to swallow bureaucracy. But this wasn't bureaucracy, this was arrogance. The kind of arrogance that convinces people progress is worth destruction. Back at the cabin, I called Eric again. His tone was heavy. "I checked your new footage and compared it with updated state surveys. You're right. They're right inside the hazard zone. If the rain forecast holds and there's an 80% chance of a 3-day front next week, that ridge could go "Can you stop them?" I asked. "I'm trying," he said. "I've escalated it to the Regional Emergency Planning Office, but jurisdiction is tangled. Your county's slow. Politically messy." "Messy how?" He hesitated. "The HOA president's married to the deputy county supervisor." Of course, that night, I didn't send emails. I wrote letters. Actual signed pages sent to county commissioners, local papers, and the regional environmental board. I packed them with evidence, video stills, geological maps, even statements from retired state geologists I'd once served beside. Still, the excavation went on. Pamela didn't back off, she doubled down. In the next HOA newsletter, she branded me a nuisance. A local eccentric with a history of blocking development, a man who thrived on baseless panic. To them, I wasn't a veteran or a geologist. I was just a cranky recluse spinning conspiracy theories from a cabin in the woods. So I did what men like me have always done. I watched. I listened. I waited. The rain came 4 days later. Not a storm, just steady, relentless sheets of water sliding down old pine trunks. The air thickened, the ground slickened. I checked the cameras every hour. By midnight, I saw it, the first crack. A hairline fracture at the top dig site. By sunrise, it had widened 3 inches. That night, I drove into town and left a USB drive at the front desk of the local news station. The note taped to it said, "If anything happens to me or this mountain, play this." When I got home, I sat on the porch with Jasper at my feet. The clouds stacked darker, heavier. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was charged. The kind of stillness before the earth itself gives way. At dawn, before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, a black SUV rolled up my gravel drive. No plates, just a tag with the name Ha Edmund. That was all the warning I needed. Jasper growled. Low, pacing the railing as the vehicle stopped. 2 men in suits climbed out. One tall stiff with a red tie pulled too tight. The other younger, slicked back hair like he'd auditioned for a courtroom drama. They looked absurd against the backdrop of moss and pine, like a corporate board had wandered into the wilderness. The tall one stepped forward. "Mr. Franklin Hale." I gave a nod. He handed me a manila envelope. "You've been served." I didn't take it. I let the silence hang, heavy as the morning fog. What exactly am I being served for? The younger one spoke up, voice clipped. Cease and desist. Defamation. Interference with development. Obstruction of HOA operations. If you keep spreading false geological claims and disrupting the crew, the HOA will pursue damages. I studied their faces. Not a flicker of doubt. Not a shred of shame. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You're cutting into a known fault line on property that isn't yours. You ignore every warning, every risk, and now you're threatening me because I won't stay quiet about the truth." The tall man shifted his weight. "You're not a licensed geologist anymore, Mr. Hale. Your credentials have lapsed. Your findings are unverified. And your so-called warnings are stirring unnecessary panic among residents." My hands tightened into fists. Jasper let out a sharp, guttural bark, one single warning shot of sound. Both men instinctively stepped back. Good boy. I finally took the envelope. Not because I accepted their threat, but because I needed to see just how far they were willing to push. "Tell Pamela to enjoy the view while she still can," I said. "Neither." Man answered. They just turned, climbed back into the SUV, and rolled down the trail, vanishing like well-dressed phantoms swallowed by the pines. Inside, I laid the envelope on the kitchen table and opened it. Heavy paper, polished letterhead, classic intimidation tactics. Legal buzzwords. Reputational damage, projected community value, unsubstantiated claims. They'd even attached screenshots from the West Ridge Community Forum, my posts with rainfall charts, trail cam stills, and slope maps. Someone on the board had flagged them as misinformation. If it weren't so dangerous, it would have been laughable. The plan was obvious, make me the fall guy. When the slope gave way, they could claim I'd fueled hysteria, disrupted progress, maybe even lied outright, but the mountain doesn't lie. And I could feel it shifting under the weight of rain. 3 days without a break. My gauge by the tool shed read 6.2 inches. Saturation threshold for that ridge by my math and by history was about 7.4. I called Eric again. They're threatening me with legal action. He exhaled into the phone. Empty threats. If they had a case, it would have gone through the county attorney, not a vague cease and desist. They just want you quiet. They won't silence me, I said. Then don't be silent, he told me. But be careful. That night, the phone rang again. A number I didn't recognize. Her name was Janet Fowler, a retired teacher, former HOA board member. She'd stepped down 6 years earlier, before Pamela seized control. Word of the project had reached her, and she tracked me down through friends at the local library. I believe you, Mr. Hale, she said. 4 words, stronger than I expected. I sank onto the edge of my bed, phone tight to my ear. Thank you, I whispered. I remember when that land was gifted to the county as protected slope, she continued. It was never meant to be touched. But Pamela changed the charter 2 years ago, Janet said. Redrew the boundaries, labeled the ridge as unused green space. That's how they got their foot in. She redrew it illegally. I said, maybe, Janet replied softly. But unless you prove it in court or get the media to care, they'll keep digging. I hesitated. Would you be willing to go on record? A pause. Then, yes, I've saved everything. Meeting minutes, emails, even some of her texts. When I hung up, sleep never came. Instead, I spent the night piecing together everything, documents, photos, trail cam logs. I built a timeline so airtight it couldn't be ignored. By dawn, I'd printed it out, bound it together, and drove into town. Rain hammered my windshield, not like weather, but like warning knocks from something ancient above us. At West Ridge Town Hall, I sat down with a journalist from the local paper, Melissa Chan. Young, sharp, skeptical. She listened as I laid out the evidence, page by page. Her expression hardened with each detail. You have actual fault line data? She asked. Yes. And you notified them twice before construction even started? Documented. She studied me for a long moment. Do you think the slope will fail? I held her gaze. I don't think, I said. I know. 3 days later, the headline hit front page. Mountain at risk. HOA ignores warnings from retired geologist. The reaction was instant. My inbox lit up like a fuse line. Some residents lashed out, accusing me of fear-mongering. Others wrote in private, quietly thanking me, asking questions Pamela had never answered in board meetings. Pamela, of course, fired back. She called the article reckless journalism, doubled down on the project's safety, and staged a press conference beneath a canopy tent flanked by Greg and Tina, smiling like politicians caught mid-scandal, but I saw it in her eyes. Behind the smile, she was sweating. Because the truth was undeniable now, the ground beneath her wasn't stable, and by the 4th straight day of rain, the mountain made sure everyone could hear it. It no longer whispered. It groaned a sound that rose from the earth, climbed into your bones, and told anyone listening that something massive below was shifting. The mountain was no longer trickling, it was bleeding. The streams that once laced the slope in delicate ribbons now tore through shale like knives, carving new channels and loosening boulders I hadn't seen shift in decades. Trees leaned at stomach-twisting angles, as if bracing themselves for what was coming. I didn't need a seismograph to know we were on borrowed time. That morning, I hiked up to my highest trail cam, the one fixed to a birch above the excavation. Sight. Only now the birch itself had begun to lean, just enough that the camera sagged toward the exposed scar of rock below. I pulled the memory card anyway, slipped it into my vest, and cut back down through the woods along the hidden path Jasper and I had always kept to ourselves. That night, I watched the footage and felt dread settle in my bones. The trucks were slogging through standing water, their tires vanishing to the hubs. Workers laid planks like stepping stones just across the mud. But the machines weren't what froze my breath. It was the ridge. Behind the retaining wall, a dark vertical seam had opened, 4 feet high, 3 inches wide. To most, it was nothing. To me, it was a countdown clock written in stone. They weren't just building into unstable ground, they were driving steel into an open wound. At dawn, I carried the footage into town. Not papers this time, but a flash drive. In thick red marker, I'd scrawled 72-hour risk. I barged into the zoning office, rain still dripping from my boots. Richard Travers, the director who dodged my calls for weeks, finally sat me down. "Richard," I said, forcing the words sharp and clear, "you need to issue a stop order immediately. There's visible shearing. The retaining wall is buckling. One more night of rain and that slope will move." He looked worn, cornered. "Frank, I don't doubt your experience, but the HOA has permits. Legally, the inspection logs don't show anything catastrophic," he added. I slammed my hand on the desk. "Because you're sending clipboard inspectors. This isn't paperwork. This is physics. The east face is collapsing under saturation. When it goes, it won't just take a trail. It'll take 3 homes and the northern access road." He rubbed his temples like a man stalling for time he didn't have. "I'll escalate it." "Don't escalate it," I said. "Act on it." But I knew how it worked. If he shut them down now and the mountain held, he'd take the political hit. If he waited and disaster struck, he could call it unforeseen. They were gambling with time. And time was nearly gone. That evening, Melissa Chan published her follow-up. Video evidence suggests HOA project site at risk of collapse. The fuse was lit, and the mountain was listening. Melissa embedded the trail cam footage directly into her article, zooming in tight on the jagged crack tearing down the ridge. She quoted Eric Ramirez, who had reviewed the video and didn't hesitate. To confirm the obvious, the slope was at immediate risk of failure. Pamela erupted. She called a closed-door HOA meeting and locked out anyone who wasn't on the board. But rumors have their own way of traveling. A landscaper who'd quit the site slipped Melissa an anonymous message. "They're building retaining walls at night. No paperwork." Trying to cover it up. That's when panic bled into the neighborhood. Board members' cars came and went at odd hours. Construction lights glared across the ridge after midnight. Greg Parsons, always the optimist, fired off a post in the community forum declaring the trail safe and the project on schedule. But the comments beneath it told a darker story. "Why does my backyard smell like wet clay? There's a crack running through my basement wall. Anyone else notice the slide on the lower trail path?" The HOA scrambled to delete the threads, but screenshots multiplied faster than they could erase them. The next morning, Pamela appeared in a pre-recorded video, standing beneath her white canopy with fog and pines staged behind her. She smiled, always smiling, while dismissing weather-related setbacks and rumors meant to stall progress. Her voice only wavered when she referred to me as a former geologist. Former, as if the truth had an expiration date. But the truth doesn't rot, it waits. That afternoon, I walked the ridge again before nightfall. The rain had thinned to mist, but the clouds sagged heavy with more to come. From a bluff I saw the entire catastrophe in waiting, the open wound of the fault, the machinery leaning like drunks, the patchwork retaining walls slapped together in panic. Then I heard it. A crack, short, sharp, like bone breaking in cold air. I dropped to the ground, palm pressed to the earth. It hummed beneath me. Not a quake yet, but the unmistakable strain of something ready to give way. When I stood, she was there. Pamela. She'd climbed up alone, probably to prove something to someone. Rain streaked her face, her breath ragged, her eyes locked on me. "What are you doing up here?" she demanded. "I could ask you the same," she gestured behind her. "Just checking the site. Making sure things are stable." I almost laughed. "Stable? You shouldn't even be here. I've walked this mountain since I was a kid, Pamela. It's not a playground, it's a living body, and you've been cutting at its knees." Her mouth opened to reply, but then came another crack. Louder, meaner. Gravel rained down the slope, tumbling like marble spilling from a jar. Pamela staggered back. "We need to go," I said. She froze for one fatal heartbeat, pride battling survival. Then she turned and followed me down in silence. That night at my cabin, I didn't sleep. I just sat awake, listening for the sound of a mountain giving up. The wind tore through the pines, a hollow whistle that rattled the night. Rain clattered against the roof like a mouthful of teeth, and beneath it all the mountain groaned deeper, longer, certain. By morning it would give way. Dawn never really came. Instead, the world outside my window shimmered in a pale metallic haze, caught between night and storm. The silence was heavy, almost deliberate, as though the mountain itself held its breath. Jasper crouched low in the corner, ears flat, his body trembling with instinct. At exactly 7:43 a.m., the sky broke. Not in drizzle, not in drops. This was a wall of water, fists of rain hammering the roof. I watched culverts choke instantly. Rivers of runoff ripping down the slope like veins bursting open. Towering trees, guardians of centuries, glistened in the torrent, roots quivering as the ground bled away beneath them. Then came the sound. 9:14 a.m., a rumble, low and caged, thunder locked inside the ribs of the earth. I froze. My mug shattered against the cabin floor. Jasper spun circles, barking in frenzy. The groan swelled into a roar, and I knew it was starting. I grabbed my camera and sprinted toward the ridge, boots skidding in the mud. Not for proof, not for lawsuits, because I had warned them. And if the mountain was going to scream, someone had to bear witness. The ridge was a nightmare of water and collapse. Torrents carved down raw scars in the slope. The retaining wall, their desperate midnight fix, split apart with a shriek like tearing steel. And then it happened. The slope exhaled, slow at first, then ripping open. The roar was apocalyptic. Entire sections of earth slid loose, ripping wide ribbons of mud and stone. Trees toppled, swallowed whole, dragged into a churning spiral of black clay that surged downhill like an avalanche of liquid earth. A yellow backhoe perched too close to the fault shuddered, then sank, vanishing in seconds. The wooden frame of their trail snapped in half, crumpling like a toy bridge, and at the center of the chaos stood Pamela Voss. She must have arrived earlier. Another attempt to control the optics. Her pristine white SUV was parked near the canopy, now a shredded flag flapping wildly. She stood motionless, mouth open, frozen in disbelief. "Move!" I shouted from across the ridge. "Run!" She stumbled back, slipping in the mud, clutching a tree trunk like a lifeline. Behind her, Greg and Tina emerged, faces drained, eyes wide, all three of them caught in the nightmare I promised was coming. But the mountain cared nothing for fear. The slide was alive now, a black tongue of ruin sweeping through every trace of human effort. The lower footbridge snapped like brittle wood. A storage trailer rolled, tumbling like a discarded tin can. The ground tore open again and again, devouring everything in its path. Pamela ran, shoes sucked off by the mire. Tina screamed into the storm. Greg collapsed to his knees, paralyzed. I kept filming, hands trembling, perched on a ledge I'd charted years ago. One of the few spots still intact. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I had once told the county this outcrop could serve as an emergency lookout during rockslide season. They had laughed. Now it was the only ground left standing. The slide raged for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Long enough to carve a new mountain face. Long enough to erase 7 months of illegal construction. Long enough to bury the HOA's falsehoods under the very land they had stolen. Then came silence again. Not peace, something heavier. The stillness that follows collapse. It doesn't vibrate, it lingers, as though the earth itself is asking, was this clear enough? I lowered the camera. The eastern slope was gone, transformed. Machinery jutted from the mud like half-buried fossils. The so-called Voss Peak path had vanished, erased as if it had never been cut at all. Carefully, I descended, radio in hand, calling for emergency crews. The HOA had never applied for geological monitoring. No alarms, no evacuation systems, no safety plan. Every safeguard had been dismissed as unnecessary spending. Now those same decision-makers sat soaked in mud, silent and broken. Pamela's khakis were drenched black, her hair plastered across her face. She didn't argue when I approached. Her bloodshot eyes met mine, not defiant, but lost, searching, unable to comprehend what the mountain had done. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The earth had delivered the verdict itself. An hour later, the fire department arrived, followed by the sheriff's deputies and a local Channel 4 news crew. They asked for statements. I gave mine simply, factually. I handed over the footage. Melissa Chan showed up soon after. Rain hood pulled tight, eyes wide at the devastation. "You were right," she whispered. "I wasn't trying to be." I answered. Medics checked Pamela and the others. No deaths, a miracle. But 5 nearby. Homes bore the scars, walls fractured, frames leaning, collateral damage. From a mountain that had finally reclaimed what was its own. 2 families were forced to abandon their homes. The eastern road was gone, replaced by churned mud and fractured asphalt where it once curved neatly along the hillside. By dusk, yellow caution tape sealed off the wreckage. I stood on my cabin porch, Jasper pressed against my leg, the air still thick with the musk of wet soil. Helicopters swept overhead. Drones hovered like persistent flies. Beneath all that noise, the mountain rested into its new form, scarred, but undeniable. That night, the HOA issued a statement. They framed the landslide as an unforeseeable natural disaster. They thanked first responders, celebrated the miracle that no lives were lost, and promised to conduct a thorough investigation. Not a single reference to the ignored warnings. Not one mention of the letters, the footage, the desperate appeals. But it no longer mattered because I had everything. Every second captured in HD, backed up 3 times with signatures, timestamps, and interviews. And so did the press. And the state geologist's office. And now, unavoidably, the public. Let them attempt to spin the story. This time, the mountain itself had provided the receipts. The morning after, I woke to a silence I hadn't heard in months. Not the calming hush of nature, but the uneasy quiet of neighbors deciding whether to face the truth or bury it deeper than the slide itself. By 8 a.m., my phone buzzed nonstop, reporters, residents, even HOA members who had once dismissed me. Now scrambling for answers, I let most calls ring out. I wasn't just tired in body, I was drained in spirit. My warnings had been laughed off until disaster forced them into reality. Now the same voices that mocked me came crawling back like termites seeking a solid beam, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt weighted. Still, I knew this moment mattered. If the truth was ever going to stick, it had to be now before they tried rewriting it again. At 10 a.m., Channel 4 aired a special segment using my footage. The anchor's voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed unease. The chyron read, "Ignored warnings. HOA trail project destroyed by record rainfall." They showed the moment the ridge cracked open, exactly as I captured it from above. Then they cut to shaky cell phone video of a backhoe vanishing into the mud. Finally, they aired Pamela sprinting, face pale, hair plastered, panic plain. I didn't take joy in seeing her collapse into chaos, but I did feel relief because that image couldn't be polished or spun away. No press release could erase it. For once, the HOA had lost control of the story. Later that day, Melissa Chan came to my porch, alone. No cameras, no lights, just a recorder and her notebook. Her jacket was damp from mist, her questions steady and careful. She let me guide the story instead of twisting it into a headline. "Did you ever think it would reach this point?" she asked. "I hoped it wouldn't," I said. "But I knew it could." "What would you tell the people who ignored your warnings?" I looked out at the jagged ridge. "I don't want an apology. I just want us to stop pretending that power makes people right. The earth doesn't care about votes, titles, or board meetings. It reacts to pressure, and eventually it breaks." She didn't interrupt. She just nodded, scribbling that line down. That evening, an email arrived. A formal notice from the State Department of Environmental Quality. They were requesting my raw data, camera logs, and documentation for use in a pending investigation. The investigation was underway. The subject line in the email was blunt: HOA misconduct, request for expert documentation. At last, it was happening. Within days, the board started to splinter. Tina Morales resigned first, claiming burnout and concern for the community's trust. Her letter, quickly posted online and leaked to the press, admitted Pamela had brushed aside repeated internal warnings about safety. Though Tina insisted she'd been pressured to fall in line with the majority. Greg Parsons followed soon after. He vanished without explanation, no statement, no defense. Just a U-Haul spotted outside his house and by morning gone. And then there was Pamela. She clung to her position like a climber without a rope. Posting vague updates on the HOA site about restructuring and collective healing. But behind the polished language, she was desperate. I knew because I got a letter from her lawyer. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a plea. They asked if I'd consider settling any civil claims privately to protect community morale, even offering a confidential mediation session with the HOA's leadership. They wanted it buried. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it, walked out to my fire pit, and dropped it into the flames. The wind carried its ashes toward the very hillside they had tried to control. That same week, a group of residents formed a recall committee not just against Pamela, but the entire HOA board. Turns out I hadn't been the only one mistreated. A veteran in the lower neighborhood revealed Pamela had threatened to fine him for displaying a support flag past the approved date. A single mother shared photos proving her car was towed without notice for overnight parking. Elderly homeowners described letters filled with condescending demands and threats of liens over something as trivial as faded paint. The landslide had exposed more than geological weakness. It had cracked open years of pent-up anger. Out of that came a movement, one they named Restore Westridge. It began with simple flyers and small gatherings at the community center. Soon after came yard signs, then neighbors knocking on doors. In less than 3 weeks, the recall group had gathered enough support to trigger a full board vote. Pamela tried to block it. She filed a motion claiming the petition had procedural flaws. The county clerk dismissed her argument outright. When the day of the vote arrived, I stood quietly at the back of the hall, arms folded, just observing. More than 200 residents showed up, a record turnout for any HOA meeting in Westridge history. The result wasn't even close. Pamela Voss was voted out, 179-6. The rest of the board fell with her. When the announcement was made, there was no cheering. Instead, a deep collective sigh filled the room, as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years. Stepping outside, I looked up at the ridge. The land was scarred but slowly healing. The HOA, however, that would take far longer to mend. The next morning, a knock came at my door. Janet Fowler, the retired teacher who had once served on the board before Pamela rewrote the charter, stood smiling with a warm pie in her hands. "Thought you might need something sweet." "After everything," she said. I chuckled. "It's been a long time since anyone brought me pie." "You saved this place," she whispered. I shook my head, eyes drifting to the tree line. "No, the mountain did." Janet followed my gaze, staring at the torn earth. "Funny thing about mountains," she said softly. "We never really own them, but somehow they own us." That night, I sat on my porch with Jasper at my feet, watching stars cut through thinning clouds. For the first time in months, I didn't feel hunted. I didn't feel silenced. I felt still. The kind of stillness that only arrives after chaos, the kind that marks a beginning. The very next morning, Eric Ramirez called. He didn't bother with greetings. "They're ready," he said. I knew exactly what he meant. The case had shifted. What began as a quiet review of the HOA's conduct was now a full legal investigation, backed with funding and authority, and most importantly, urgency. I loaded my truck with everything I'd gathered. 3 hard drives, a binder thick enough to rival my military field manuals, printed photos, GPS logs, and every email I'd written or received, each carefully organized and annotated. I'd learned the hard way that truth without order could still vanish in the noise. I made sure everything was easy to find. The drive to the state capitol took 4 quiet hours. I didn't play the radio, just let the steady hum of tires and the endless stretch of pines calm my nerves. Their roots ran deeper than most people's honesty. Eric was waiting outside the Department of Environmental Quality. The building was a tired block of concrete and glass that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 90s. His handshake was firm, familiar. Same state-issued windbreaker, same steady eyes, though. "Wearier than before. You ready?" he asked. "Been ready since they ignored the first warning." He led me through security and into a conference room where 3 others waited. A state geologist, an attorney from the Attorney General's office, and a representative from the Office of Public Integrity. I knew her reputation. She'd taken down several major land abuse cases in the past decade. I set the binder on the table, drew in a breath. Everything's in here. And if that's not enough, I brought video evidence too. For the next 3 hours, we went piece by piece, excavation in unstable zones, trail cam timestamps, retaining walls collapsing before the landslide, drone footage of workers ignoring boundary signs, and the before and after topography overlays I'd compiled. They didn't interrupt much, just took notes. Now and then, I caught one raising their eyebrows at another. When I showed them the cease and desist letter the HOA sent me accusing me of spreading panic, the liar actually let out a quiet laugh. When it was done, Eric closed the binder with a pat, like settling a restless dog. "This is enough to trigger a multi-agency review," he said. "You might have just opened the floodgates." The woman from Public Integrity leaned forward. Do you have recordings of direct conversations with Voss or other board members acknowledging your warnings? I nodded. 2. One video, one audio. Both in the files. She allowed herself the faintest smile. That's the kind of thing that doesn't vanish in committee. Walking out of the building, I felt something unusual. Not just exhaustion, but peace. It was out of my hands now. My job had never been to hold the weight forever. It was to make sure truth landed somewhere it couldn't be buried by PR spins and legal threats. By the time I returned to Westridge, change was already underway. The interim HOA board made up of longtime residents and past volunteers had voted to freeze every development project indefinitely. They also opened the public archive of every HOA meeting record, including ones conveniently missing from official newsletters. Those documents laid bare years of misconduct, financial schemes, intimidation campaigns, and quiet backdoor agreements. One report revealed Pamela Voss had funneled over $300,000 in discretionary funds to friendly contractors, including the same firm behind the failed retaining wall. Another exposed that a former board member who had tried to raise concerns early had been pressured into resigning and forced to sign an NDA. The community's reaction was immediate. Residents weren't just angry, they were furious. Some residents wanted lawsuits. Others just wanted to rebuild the community they thought they'd lost. The new board organized listening circle simple gatherings where neighbors could speak freely, vent, and begin restoring trust. I was invited to one. At first, I had no intention of going. I wasn't chasing recognition, but Janet knocked on. My porch with that sharp teacher-like look that meant skipping wasn't an option. You don't have to talk, she told me. Just show up. So I did. The meeting was held in the same hall where Pamela once stood smiling beneath bright banners. This time, the setup was different. Chairs arranged in a circle. No podium, no microphones, just neighbors, some looking embarrassed, others relieved. When I finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. I didn't fight the HOA, I said. I fought for the mountain and for the right to be heard before everything collapsed around us. Heads nodded. A few clapped quietly. Afterward, a young couple approached me. Eric and Danielle, new homeowners who had moved in just last year. Their toddler balanced on a hip as they thanked me for protecting what they now considered sacred ground. I always thought HOA rules were just part of the deal, Eric admitted. Now I see silence was the real danger. Danielle added softly, "You gave us back our voice." Their little boy reached out to pat Jasper, who leaned into the touch like he understood the moment. Days later, the Office of Public Integrity began issuing subpoenas for HOA records. Pamela Voss hired a lawyer with a reputation for spin control, but it didn't matter where it had already spread. A local environmental group launched a petition to designate the ridge and its slopes as a protected natural zone, untouchable by developers. Within a week, it had gathered thousands of signatures. And came a call not from the governor himself, but from his deputy environmental advisor. He asked if I'd be willing to testify at a state hearing about HOA overreach and the environmental risks tied to unchecked development. They were reviewing statewide land use policy and needed first-hand voices. I agreed not because I wanted the spotlight, but because so many others never got the chance. The quiet families fined into silence. The elderly man who lost his garage over a paint code. The single mother punished for planting rosebush that didn't match. I had fought for a mountain. Now maybe that mountain could fight for something greater. 3 weeks later, I stood in a government building under harsh lights, sipping coffee that tasted like paper. Comfort wasn't the point. I was there to speak. The hearing chamber was full. Journalists, state officials, activists, even a few retired HOA board members from other districts. I wore my best jacket that day, not for show, but out of respect. I carried two things with me: a thumb drive loaded with every video and piece of evidence, and a black and white photo of my grandfather. In it, he stood proudly beside the cabin he built in 1960, shovel in hand, grinning like he'd convinced the mountain to let him stay. I placed the photo on the table before me. When my name was called, I stood. "I'm not a politician," I began, "and I'm not here pretending to be one. My name is Franklin Hale. I'm a retired geological engineer, a veteran, and a homeowner. And for the past year, my fight hasn't been against bureaucracy. It's been against arrogance disguised as authority." I took them through the story slowly, not as a deposition, but as a memory. I explained how I'd warned them, how the science was dismissed, and how they went ahead anyway. Then I showed the footage, the unstable slope, the collapse, the wreckage that followed. After that, I spoke of the human cost, the families uprooted, the homes in danger, the threats, the intimidation, the sheer denial. They claimed to build a trail to bring the neighborhood together, I said, but instead they split it apart. They ignored warnings not because they were unclear, but because they came from someone without a title. That line ended up in 2 newspapers the very next morning. When I sat down, I glanced at the panel. They weren't just scribbling notes anymore, they were leaning in, listening in a way that made them question what they thought they knew. The hearing wrapped with a recommendation: a statewide commission to review HOA power over land use, especially in communities near sensitive terrain. They invited me to join as an advisor. I declined, not out of resentment, but because I knew my part was done. That night, I returned to the rebuilt trail overlooking the slope. The state had already declared the ridge an ecological hazard zone, off-limits for future development. The new HOA, board less flashy, more grounded, had voted to fund reinforcements for the remaining trailheads and add an educational display with geological diagrams and historic photos. They asked if they could put my name on a plaque. I refused, but I gave them another idea. "Name the ridge after my grandfather," I said. "He was the one who respected it first." Weeks slipped by. Seasons shifted. Grass crept back across the scarred face of the mountain. Wildflowers mostly. Fireweed sprang up stubbornly where machines had torn the earth. As always, nature began to heal, with or without us. One morning, I woke to a knock on my door. It was Melissa Chan again, this time holding a copy of her newly published feature story, "The Mountain That Spoke: How One Man's Warning Changed a State." She smiled and said, "You're a reluctant legend now." I laughed. "I'd rather just be a quiet man with a dog and a working rain gauge." She left me a signed copy anyway. That afternoon, I took Jasper on a long walk up the ridge. We passed the place where the first backhoe had cut into the soil, now softened with moss. The sky was steady. Birds hopped through the branches. The air smelled clean again. At the top, I stopped by the new sign the HOA had raised: Hale Ridge Protected Natural Zone, dedicated to Bernard Hale, 1926 to 1999. I closed my eyes and let the wind wash over me. For a moment, I imagined my grandfather, standing there, hands on his hips, surveying the land with that quiet pride only a man who worked it with calloused hands could carry. And I smiled, because in the end, the mountain never truly belonged to us. But it remembered who listened, and it rewarded those who fought for it with silence, the good kind, the kind that fills your lungs with more than air, something closer to peace. Back at the cabin, I brewed a cup of tea, not coffee, and let the evening drift through the open window. Jasper snored at my feet as I sat on the porch. Down the hill, a new family had moved in. They waved when they passed in the mornings. Kids' laughter carried along the gravel road again. And for the first time in months, The HOA wasn't an enemy, it was simply neighbors, trying to rebuild what community really meant. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't fighting anymore. I was just watching quietly, the way the mountain always had, and at last the land was at peace.